for today, Tabitha Thompson.
Thanks so much, Ben, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Ben mentioned, my name is Tabitha Thompson, and I serve as the Acting Director and Senior Program Officer for the U.S. Institute of Peace's Program on Nonviolent Action. At the NVA team at USIP, we focus on applied research and capacity building to better understand and support nonviolent movements around the world as they seek to advance human rights, justice, and sustainable peace through people power or collective action that builds power from the bottom up. And I'm very excited to moderate this third event in the ASIL ICNC series. As Hardy mentioned during the first event of the series, it's exciting to bring together these two communities who are both concerned with human rights, access to justice, and the rule of law, but who have different approaches to their work, with the international law community being more focused on institutions and utilizing institutional processes, while the nonviolent action community focuses on mobilizing ordinary people to apply pressure extra-institutionally. Today, we'll focus on the topic of external support to movements, highlighting what forms of support are most effective based on the latest research, as well as what forms of support are permissible under international law. This topic is particularly timely as we approach the one-year mark of COVID-19's classification as a global pandemic. Over the past year, we've seen how nonviolent movements have adapted and innovated, using virtual and socially distanced tactics to achieve their goals and support fellow citizens through mutual aid networks. And we've also seen how international actors and donors have had to adapt in how they support movements, from hosting virtual trainings and networking opportunities to placing greater trust and decision-making power in grassroots partners on the front lines. Thus, we find ourselves at an opportune time to imagine new ways of thinking when it comes to external support to movements. And we can consider how external actors can utilize people-centered frameworks such as right to assist, and explore how adaptations made under COVID-19 can be conducive to operationalizing these frameworks and recommendations moving forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our powerhouse panel. Dr. Maria Stephan is the co-author of the forthcoming ICNC monograph entitled The Role of External Support to Nonviolent Campaigns, Poison Chalice or Holy Grail, which is expected to be released shortly. Maria's career has bridged the academic, policy, and nonprofit sectors with a focus on the role of civil resistance and nonviolent movements in advancing human rights, democratic freedoms, and sustainable peace globally. She is the co-author of Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, and most recently, she served as the director for the Program on Nonviolent Action at USIP and my boss. Hardy Merriman is the president and CEO of ICNC, and he has worked in the field of civil resistance for over 18 years. From 2016 to 2018, he was also an adjunct lecturer at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. He is the author of the ICNC special report, or co-author rather, Preventing Mass Atrocities, From a Responsibility to Protect to a Right to Assist, Campaigns of Civil Resistance, which he will speak about shortly. And last but certainly not least, Farida Nebarema is a political activist and a writer who has been a fearless advocate for democracy and human rights in Togo since she was a teenager. She is the co-founder and executive director of the Togolese Civil League, an NGO that promotes democracy and the rule of law in Togo. And she is currently serving as a Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at USIP, where she is researching gender-based repression and violence in nonviolent movements and how women activists and allies can respond. Thank you all for taking the time to be here today to share more about your work and research. Each panelist will have about 10 to 15 minutes to present, and after we'll open up for audience Q&A. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Maria to get us started.
Great, thank you so much, Tabitha, for that introduction and nice framing for our conversation today. And special thanks to Hardy and ICNC and Ben and ASIL for co-sponsoring today's event and the series that you've been hosting. Just in reflecting upon today's event and the American Society for International Law, it's just increasingly striking to me, and I think it's become abundantly clear, especially over the past year, just how integrally linked domestic and foreign policy are. And there are a lot of interesting conversations going on right now about, well, what can Americans, democracy organizers, human rights activists learn from, activist organizers, Democrats in other parts of the world. And I found it really interesting that most recently, we saw Burmese generals who took inspiration from the attempt to overturn the election results in the United States as a motivation for their recent coup, the coup that's underway right now. Similarly, we've seen in the wake of the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, there's been just a ream of anti-protest bills that are being passed across the country in Florida and elsewhere. And it's just so reminiscent of all these anti-NGO bills and efforts to close civic space around the world. So I think it's, just becoming more apparently clear how interconnected US and international, politics and systems are. And, we're having this conversation at a time when authoritarianism is resurgent, both in this country and around the world. Some of you may have been following. Freedom House has been tracking global freedoms for years. They found that there's been a 14-year decline in global civil and political rights and freedoms around the world. Similarly, the World Justice Project has marked a noteworthy decline in the rule of law around the world, increase in corruption, erosion of checks and balances. So this is just a troubling but seemingly durable trend over the past decade plus. Meanwhile, at the same time, there's been a tremendous uptick in the number of protests and protest movements all around the world. 2019, I think, was referred to the year of the protester by Time and others. And I was looking at the ASIL website and I noticed that Betsy Anderson recently posted a really great article about the rise of protests around the world. And she was particularly reflecting on the UN Human Rights Committee's guidance in light of the surge of protests around the world, which I found really, really interesting. There are many causes for these protests, but I mean, fundamentally, it's about people's grievances not being met, distrust in governance, lots of different factors. But this leads us to the conversation about civil resistance and movements. So we're seeing this proliferation of protests and people power movements around the world at the same time that we're seeing, seemingly strengthening of autocratic and authoritarian norms and practices around the world. And, the interesting thing about civil resistance, which is a means for people to advance rights, freedoms, democracy, using tactics like boycotts, strikes, protests, civil disobedience, non-cooperation. Civil resistance and social movements have historically been significant drivers of social, political, economic change around the world. Movements using these nonviolent tactics have helped abolish slavery in the United States and the apartheid regime in South Africa, gain workers' rights, women's suffrage, advance civil political rights. And, particularly importantly, I think for this conversation is that nonviolent civil resistance has been particularly effective historically at challenging authoritarianism and in advancing democracy. Tabitha mentioned a book that I co-authored with Erica Chenoweth a few years ago. And Erica, who is a political scientist at Harvard, she and I collected data on over 330 major violent and nonviolent campaigns that have taken place over the past century. And these were campaigns that were challenging mainly authoritarian autocratic regimes or that were vying for territorial self-determination. And we were interested in understanding, well, can nonviolent resistance be effective in these cases? And how effective has nonviolent resistance been compared to armed struggle? And the main finding of that research was that the nonviolent resistance campaigns had been twice as effective as the armed struggles in achieving their maximalist objectives. So, removing incumbent regimes. So they had been twice as effective historically. And not only that, we found that the civil resistance campaigns were very strongly correlated with democratization. And this is a finding that has been reinforced through multiple independent studies. So, the probably the single most important reason why nonviolent movements have historically been so effective at challenging authoritarian regimes is that they tend to attract large and diverse numbers of people. Lots of people can participate in nonviolent resistance using all these different range of nonviolent tactics, ranging from protest, persuasion, to strikes, boycotts. So there's lots of ways for people to get involved. We also found that movements that were able to maintain nonviolent discipline in the face of regime or paramilitary repression tend to be able to maintain participation and achieve success. So participation, nonviolent discipline, we also found that campaigns that were able to diversify their tactics, so meaning not just relying on street rallies and demonstrations, but using acts of dispersion like consumer boycotts, strikes. So being able to draw on a wide range of tactics was particularly effective. And so that brings us to the question of external actors. And I must say this topic of what roles have external actors played historically in supporting nonviolent movements has been of particular personal interest to me. Certainly it began when I worked many years ago at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, which is where I met Hardy Merriman, who's become a comrade ever since. ICNC's work was focused on developing, disseminating knowledge, know-how about how to wage nonviolent struggle effectively. And that work brought me into contact with activist movements all around the world. And just seeing the power of information, of translated materials, of having, supporting access to information about how to use nonviolent means to bring about change, even in incredibly repressive environments, was a source of inspiration for me, for sure. Later on, definitely an experience that has fundamentally affected my thinking on this topic was serving in the US State Department, where my last assignment was working with the Syrian opposition. This was about a year into the revolution. It was a time when in 2012, the nonviolent resistance was being eclipsed by armed struggle. And I was with the State Department, and our focus was on trying to help the nonviolent activists and the pro-democracy movement in the face of, huge countervailing forces. And it was just, a remarkable experience. Lawyers, there was a very heavy involvement of lawyers at the State Department who were very concerned about, our provision of material, non-material assistance, where it would end up. And so it was this question of, when I left, and certainly the tragedy that resulted in Syria as kind of the nonviolent resistance was replaced by mostly armed struggle, a very brutal regime became even more brutal. And we saw just like an escalation of casualties, deaths, and the humanitarian crisis that we've seen. So that raised for me a fundamental question of, well, what could external actors have done differently in a case like that, in other places, to have made a difference? Was there anything that could have been done differently? That helped to inspire certainly some of the research that I've subsequently done. I'll mention some of the findings of the report that I've been working on with Erica Chenoweth. But I went from the State Department to the U.S. Institute of Peace, and it's wonderful to be on the screen with both Tabitha and Farida, who are my colleagues, former colleagues at USIP, because really the focus of the program on nonviolent action has been to amplify and elevate the voices and perspectives of grassroots activists and movements, and to show how they are fundamental international actors, and to be able to listen to them and provide support for training, access to information, and the like. So a lot of our work at USIP has been about trying to analyze and assess the impact of donor support to movements, especially anti-corruption movements. And some of the kind of key findings from that research and some of the training and education work that we've been doing overseas is very much reflected in the study that I've recently completed with Erica Chenoweth, which is on the role of external actors vis-a-vis major nonviolent movements. So I'm going to conclude in a few minutes by just sharing with you some of the main findings from this research. So basically, Erica and I spent the past few years collecting data. So this was a study conducted over a few years using mixed methods, both quantitative and qualitative means. And we were trying to understand how various forms of support, both governmental and non-governmental, affect the characteristics and the outcomes of major nonviolent campaigns. And we focused our study on the post-2000 period. So we're looking at all the kind of major studies that were done during that time period. And so we were looking at, the role of governments, foundations, NGOs, transnational solidarity groups, and looking at the type of assistance they were providing in the pre-mobilization period, during the peak mobilization, and in the 5 years after. And so I won't describe all the methodology involved in this study, but basically the top finding of this research, if I were to summarize in one sentence, is that nonviolent campaigns tend to benefit the most from external assistance that helps to increase participation, that helps to reduce repression or mitigate crackdowns, that tends to help movements maintain nonviolent discipline, and that helps elicit security force defections. So that's like bottom line what the qualitative and the quantitative data reflected. And a few key takeaways from the research. And I should say we did both a quantitative study, and then I was mainly responsible for doing deep dives on 9 different case studies, including a number of Arab Spring countries. And so the main point was that the external assistance was always secondary to local actors. There's nothing external actors can do to create or orchestrate a successful nonviolent campaign, notwithstanding what autocrats want you to believe. Secondly, we found that long-term assistance and investment in civil society and democratic institutions help to create an enabling environment for nonviolent campaigns' success. So especially investments in independent media, think tanks, electoral institutions, things like that. Third, we found that the training of activists prior to peak mobilization consistently proved to be helpful for the activists and the campaign. So the training and nonviolent action and organizing and violence prevention, all of these trainings seem to be quite helpful. We found, fourthly, that mitigating regime repression via political, diplomatic, and security engagement can be critical. And so we had some interesting cases of diplomatic interventions, how security leverage and assistance was used to disincentivize crackdowns on activists. So that type of violence mitigation is really, really important. We also found that foreign government assistance is particularly helpful and effective in the aftermath of a major nonviolent campaign, in reinforcing the rule of law, in strengthening democratic institutions. So a lot of the observations that we were seeing of foreign government assistance was happening in the post-transition period. We also found that assistance to armed actors very much undermined nonviolent campaigns. So when you saw simultaneous attempts to support armed actors and nonviolent actors, you tended to see a militarization of the conflict, a rise in casualties and deaths. So it wasn't helpful to be able to mix forms of assistance, violent, nonviolent. In the 7th major finding, and I promise there are only 2 others after that, 7th major finding was that allied support for repressive regimes is a significant challenge for activists. Especially, so think Russia and Iran's support for the Assad regime, and in Syria, Russia's support for Lukashenko and Belarus. So, especially when allied governments are providing security intelligence assistance, helping them crack down, use cyber repression, spread misinformation, this tends to be very, very, poses a huge challenge for activists. 8th point is that the jury is still out on whether direct financial assistance to movements is helpful or not. that. There didn't seem to be any kind of conclusive evidence that it was, particularly important for the success of movements, and there were kind of some pros and cons. What really mattered was how assistance was provided. So how, donors were providing assistance. Was it laborious with lots of bureaucracy, inflexibility, or was it flexible, timely, responsive assistance that was following the agendas of the activists and movements? And then finally, there was a point on just the importance of donor coordination in the ability to be able to provide effective support to nonviolent movements. Donors often are encouraging movements to be unified and cohesive, but often they're in complete disarray and having different messages, different approaches, all that kind of thing. So donor coordination is really key. So those just, a summary of some of the key takeaways from the research, and really excited to talk with everyone during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maria. This is there's a lot to unpack there, really interesting findings. I mean, I think a couple of things that just struck me was just in thinking about, considering the entire ecosystem in which external support happens and the different players on the ground that might be involved, whether they're armed or non-armed actors, as well as just the process, and not just what types of support are provided, but the process, and not just looking at on the ground, but turning the mirror on ourselves rather, and how we can better support to be better, or better coordinate to be better supporters. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Hardy.
Great, thank you, Tabitha. I'm going to try to screen share. Let's see if this works. Everyone see my screen? Can I get a thumbs up? Perfect, great. All right, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to ASIL for your collaboration. And I want to really thank Maria as well for her remarkable work, groundbreaking and very timely and relevant research right now. I want to build on what Maria said a bit and share a proposal for a framework on how to support nonviolent movements. This is called the right to assist. It's been advanced by me and my colleague Peter Ackerman at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. I think it could not be more important now than for the international community to think more clearly and more strategically about how to be collaborative and effective in supporting movements. So I'll get into right to assist for a little bit, but first let me back up my point. Why is it so important right now? And I want to focus on two international trends. And the first is one that Maria mentioned, which is rising authoritarianism. You can look at a variety of different measures of this. It's fairly well established that this trend is prevalent. The organization Freedom House documents it going on for 14 years. And here's one way of visualizing it. In this chart, the red circles represent the number of countries in a given year where Freedom House marked a decline in freedom. And the number of bluish circles, or the number in the bluish circles above, represents the number of countries where Freedom House marked an advance in freedom. And we can see clearly from 2006 that declines have outpaced advances every single year. This is the longest single continuous decline of democracy and advance in authoritarianism since Freedom House started keeping track. And so this trend, on any given year, one can claim, well, perhaps it was a fluke, but at this point it's unmistakable and very, very damaging, and with some pretty severe and dire implications. A more authoritarian world is a world where there's going to be more human rights abuse, right? We're already seeing this. It's a world where there's going to be more violent conflict, more atrocities, humanitarian crises, corruption, which does not respect borders, closing civic space, undermining of democracies, and weakening of international accountability mechanisms. For 14 years, there's just a growth in this very disturbing trend, and the implications are already clear to us, and they're going to get worse if it continues. I regard rising authoritarianism as an urgent threat to international security and to national security. Now, we can look at the other side, where civil resistance, which has a history of being a powerful way of confronting authoritarianism and advancing democracy, what do we see? Well, if we look at the headlines, here are some headline grabbing movements from the last 3 years. There has been, at least, if you look at media, increased reporting on movements and certainly an increase in activity. And the stats bear this out. I mean, this chart taken from Erica Chenoweth shows those striped bars on the chart represent the number of new civil resistance movements that are trying to get a political transition, so-called maximalist civil resistance movements, the number of new movements in a given decade. And we can see in the 1990s, the number of new movements that emerged was just over 40. And we can see that in the last decade, the number of new civil resistance movements documented is about 96. It's a huge increase over a couple decades. We can also see, interestingly, that the number of new violent insurgencies, these are bars that are solid, are actually declining. And so, you know, in one sense, it's not surprising that as authoritarianism rises, you get civil resistance movements rising to try to meet it. It's sort of like an immune response to a pathogen of authoritarianism that's spreading. As authoritarianism spreads, people lose faith that their institutions and elections and legal system will work for them, and they try to find other ways to confront it through civil resistance, through non-institutional means to try to challenge it. Now, historically, again, if we look at the trends, the data, that should be good news, right? You have a very powerful democratizing force that was proven over the last century to be very effective at confronting authoritarianism. But there are a few other trends within the civil resistance trend that we need to look at to see some particular challenges right now. And the first is that authoritarians are learning. As someone working in this field since 2002, I remember in 2006 just noticing, wow, the rhetoric authoritarians are using about movements seems to be coordinated much more across each other. Authoritarians seem to be collaborating a lot more on legislation and best practices to repress movements. There really seems to be an offensive to try to squash movements, delegitimize them, that is international in scope. And that has continued. Authoritarians have learned how to try to prevent movements from developing, how to more effectively repress them in ways that minimize the backfire against the repression, and to help each other out, to make emergency loans if their economies need it, to provide diplomatic cover for each other in the UN or other multilateral institutions, to help each other sometimes even by saying, we'll send workers to your country if strikers in your country are making things too difficult for you. So there's a lot of coordination in authoritarian learning. And I would argue on the other side, advocates and people who support democracy and human rights have not been nearly as effective or organized in supporting movements as authoritarians have been in trying to squash it. Now, perhaps as a result of authoritarian learning or other factors, there are some other key things I want to highlight. And this is from the work of Erica Chenoweth. And really alarmingly, Erica looked and found that the average mobilization, peak mobilization of a movement in the 1990s, a nonviolent movement in the 1990s, was 2.7% of the national population. It's a big number. And when you consider the fact that participation, percentage of public participation is probably, if you were to say what's a single most important factor in movement success, it would be participation rates. That really matters. And it especially matters because when we look at the last decade, the average peak participation level was 1.3%. In other words, participation rates have dropped by about half over the last 2 to 3 decades. This is very concerning. Another thing that's concerning is that between 1970 and 2010, on average, a civil resistance movement had a 30 to 35% chance of having a violent flank alongside it. And in the last decade, that number increased to 50%. Now, there's different views on violent flanks and the role they play in movements. I will argue that they reduce movement success rates, that they increase the risk of violent repression against movements, and that even if movements succeed in getting a political transition, the presence of a violent flank reduces the chance of a democratic outcome afterwards, and also increases the chance of violent conflict afterwards. I would argue quite strongly, violent flanks on average are not a good development for movements. So just looking at a few factors, there are others we can look at social media, but just what I'm saying here, on the one hand, it's encouraging there are more civil resistance movements trying to counter this authoritarian trend. However, these movements have some real challenges, ranging from authoritarian learning to challenges within the movements themselves. And at the end of the day, the success rates tell the tale. If you look at success rates in the 1990s, the high watermark for nonviolent movement success, movements trying to get political transitions in the 1990s had a 65% success rate. It's remarkable. By the last decade, that success rate had dropped to 34%. Now, violence, marked here by the dotted line, is doing even worse. Violent insurgency, now in the last decade, had a success rate of 8%. So you can clearly say that civil resistance movements is a much better strategic choice in general than violence. However, the fact that you've gone from 65% to 34% success rates over 20, 30 years is really, really concerning. So not to put too fine a point on it, what's the implication of this? I'm going to make a really strong claim. Unless something changes, there's not going to be enough power supporting democracy to reverse the rising authoritarian trend. The data on civil resistance and democratization is so clear and so strong and so replicated over the last decade that movements are doing amazing work right now, being under-resourced and under-supported. They cannot hold out forever unless there is more support for them, unless there are stronger ways to counter movements. It's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to reverse this rising authoritarian trend. So something has to change. And that brings me to the right to assist. Now, again, Peter Ackerman and I wrote this special report, which is freely available. I can put a link after I'm done talking for folks to download it. It's available in English, Arabic, French, and Spanish. And what we do is we say, look, we make an argument that if you support civil resistance movements, there are actually some links to reducing atrocities. So you can look at this as an atrocity prevention doctrine. Here, I'm just going to talk about it as a way to advance democratic rule stability and democratic peace, which is related. And it's a simpler argument to make. But you can think of the right to assist, first of all, as just a set of common principles and guidelines about support to civil resistance movements that you could adopt within your institution. If you're thinking, how can my institution or organization take a more movement-centered approach? If you download this special report, it's aimed to help you think through that within your institution. But we think it can be much more than that. We think right to assist could be, and the way we lay it out, could be the beginning of a normative framework that legitimizes international support and guides collaboration among a range of international actors, from NGOs to states and others. You could even begin to think of it as the beginning of a proposed doctrine that would govern international support to civil resistance campaigns. Peter and I put out the ideas, we framed it, we did a lot of thinking, some of which I'll go through with you in the time I have left. But it's really to others to continue to bring this along. One thing is clear, coming back to my point a few slides ago, we have to start doing things differently and think much more systematically about the challenges we face and the central role that movements play in the ecosystem of trying to create peace and democracy and human rights in this world. So a few things from the special report. We give a typology of 5 kinds of external support, and Maria's research and Erica Chenoweth's research that she referenced is incredibly important in sort of talking about what works. But I'll just share 5 different kinds. The first is public education. This is just public information sharing and education campaigns, supporting research about civil resistance, translating that research. This is generically getting information out there about nonviolent ways to advance human rights and democracy. In a lot of countries, this information is not widely accessible or not widely shared or actively repressed. So just putting it out there generically is a form of support. And it's indirect because you're not necessarily targeting any one group. The second is capacity building. This is targeted. It could be targeted information sharing through workshops, providing meeting space to certain pro-democracy or human rights groups, connecting them with activists across borders so they can mentor each other, making small targeted grants. Though I think grants can be very equivocal. If they're not done well, they can do more harm than good. We get into some of that in the report. A third would be supporting populations in conflict, offering money for strike funds, for legal aid, for emergency and urgent assistance for human rights defenders. A fourth is a range of things around raising the cost of repression, naming and shaming, sanctions, launching international investigations, withdrawing support from offending governments, support for whistleblowers, unarmed accompaniment, diplomats attending rallies or court hearings, derecognition in extreme cases where a government has lost all legitimacy. The international community could derecognize that government. And then a fifth is fostering political transition. When people are demanding democracy and an authoritarian has lost any claim on legitimacy, doing nothing, saying we can't get involved, it's too political, has a real cost at that point. It functionally favors an autocrat who's lost legitimacy. So when populations demand it and an autocrat has lost legitimacy, providing opposition groups space to negotiate, plan, pledging transitional assistance, formal recognition of the opposition, supporting back channel negotiations. There's a range of ways the international community can help. Now, to be sure, a number of groups are doing these things already. The point of R2A is to systematically think through these forms of support, coordinate them, and think through their relationship to movements on the ground. So it's an attempt to be much more intentional and deliberate, and also to legitimize these forms of support that authoritarians would like to stop. You'll also notice in this 5-part typology that there's a range of more interventionist forms of support, like fostering a political transition, to much less interventionist forms of support, like public education, simple information sharing. And that's there by design. There are tiers that could be triggered of external support, depending on the degree of repression used against nonviolent movements. Now, to go beyond the idea that this is something we should do, Peter Ackerman and I also looked at, okay, when the rubber meets the road, when we have to get really clear there actually about how to do this, there are a number of questions that emerge that need to be addressed. So one is simply, how do you define what nonviolent campaign should receive assistance? Another is, okay, I want to support civil resistance, but is that synonymous with supporting regime change? A third is, I want to help, but what if it has a harmful impact? Or what if external support contributes to societal instability? What forms of external support are permissible under international law? And then lastly, if we think about R2A as a potential doctrine, how should it be invoked and who should exercise oversight? Now, I don't have time to get into these now. Maybe we can in question and answer. I encourage people to read the report where we address all of these, because we want our ideas to be scrutinized. We want people to improve them, refine them, and advance them. But we do attempt to answer all of these questions drawing on the best data and research we can find. I'll just close with the first one. You know, we provided 3 preliminary criteria for campaigns to receive assistance. The first is that the campaign has to be committed to nonviolent discipline. It's hard to discern exactly how committed a campaign can be if they have rallies and there are people who show up and are violent sometimes. But if the campaign says, as a public matter, we're committed to nonviolent discipline, leaders reassert that pledge, they train people as being to remain nonviolent, they condemn violence when it breaks out, though that's all evidence that the campaign meets this first criteria. The second is the campaign has goals consistent with universally recognized human rights. I won't go further on that at the moment, only to say that some could say, well, you know, certain campaigns might be tools of foreign influence. There's a whole bunch we could say about that and why actually that claim might be quite overblown. But for now, if rights are at stake, rights are being violated, and the campaign wants rights that are universally recognized, if it meets that criteria, that's another one that would be enabling. And then the third is that the campaign not be a political party. The international community has an interest in having free and fair elections, democratic elections, processes that are fair and legal. And so for that reason, it's important that the international community not be seen as putting their thumb on the scale. So political party support would be different than a movement support. Movements do engage in election activity sometimes, but it's important to try to draw as clear a line as you can that you're dealing with a nonviolent campaign that may engage in political activity rather than a particular political party. I will stop there and put a link in the chat for people to download it. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Hardy. I think that this was like particularly powerful, one, and just kind of painting the picture on why this support is important now and these discussions are supporting now, and then not just talking about the framework of how it can be legitimate, but the actual how and challenging questions and concerns that external actors have to grapple with when they're actually thinking about what the support looks like practically. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Farida.
Thank you, Tabata. I would like to thank Maria and Hardy for their presentation. I kind of like appreciate the way Maria comes from the research academic perspective, and Hardy comes with the practitioner experience as well. I'm going to focus my intervention mostly on my experience working as a civil society leader and an activist in Togo. So in terms of international external support to nonviolent movement, in Togo, this is something that we believe is critical, and I'll kind of like section the different type of support that we have felt were relevant to us and how we went forward to obtain them. So we have institutional support, we have individual and grassroots movement support, and then we have support from international civil society organizations, NGOs working on human rights and democracy stuff. In terms of institutional support, I will say that sometimes when it comes to external support, the support can actually mean I wouldn't say being neutral, but simply not taking the side of the government that is repressing citizens when they are demanding democracy and change. In the case of Togo, for example, in 2017, when we organized protests in the countries and the government shut down the internet, there was basically no reaction in the immediate, in the short run from international bodies that Togo is part of. And by that, I mean institutions like the ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States, and the African Union as well. So I particularly, myself and other comrades, we traveled to Abuja in Nigeria at the headquarters of ECOWAS and demanded from the ECOWAS to condemn the use of violence against protesters, and also to condemn the shutdown of the internet, which is a violation of freedom of speech and freedom of access to information stipulated under the ECOWAS Protocol of Democracy and Good Governance. So we were only calling them to respect their own framework, which Togo is a signatory of. And then we traveled later on to the Gambia in the same week, actually, to the Gambia in Banjul, to the African Human and People Rights Court, and then we submitted a petition to the court demanding that the government of Togo be investigated for violating freedom of access to information. And the chair of the court also happened to be the chair of the Freedom of Internet Committee at the African Union. So we felt like this is something that is happening that you are supposed to ensure doesn't actually happen. We would like you to take a further step to condemn it and then investigate it. And it did yield results, not immediately. At the ECOWAS level, they did issue a statement condemning the shutdown of the internet and asking the government of Togo to stop using violence against citizens. But then at the African Union level, because it's a court and judicial system, it took over a year for the court to actually appoint a rapporteur and investigate the issue. And just last year in 2020, the government of Togo was sanctioned for that shutdown that happened in 2017. Beyond the institutional level, I'm talking about individual and grassroots movement support. And by that, this one is important for different reasons. First of all, information sharing, knowledge sharing is very much important because authoritarian regimes operate in very similar manners across countries and across continents. And the same way, they usually consult one another one way or another, learning lessons from repressive methods and applying them to their country context. So sometimes being able to engage with activists from other countries that went through similar situations kind of like becomes an eye-opener and help us strategize better. So we have engage directly with activists from neighboring countries to start with that have similar situations, and then activists from other regions on the continent as well that also found themselves in a situation where they were demanding change from an authoritarian government. To many extent, I would say this was positive in terms of us being able to gain access to certain information that we didn't have, and also being able to raise awareness about the ongoing struggle in Togo. In the Gambia, for example, you had some Gambian youth who created a Twitter group, and all they were doing was helping share information about what was happening in Togo on Twitter. And the Togolese community itself was not very much present on Twitter then, but that support was something that was different. And us being a French-speaking countries, gaining that support from an English-speaking one also helped break the language barrier and lead the message to a bigger crowd. And finally, I'm going to talk about international CSOs, such as international NGOs. We did repatriated major organizations that we see as supportive of civil society organizations in Africa. And we have noticed that in the case of Togo, the majority of them have led in the mid-90s. They gave up to some extent to the possibility of Togo being able to bring down, to end the dictatorship in Togo. So we did one-on-one meetings. We toured basically countries in the United States and in Europe and also part of Africa, demanding that they come back and provide support to Togolese society groups, and especially the Togolese media that is basically has no resources whatsoever to function. So the private media that is against the government is asphyxiated. They have no resources, and the government also prevents private companies from advertising with them. So obtaining grants from institutions will help reboost our media. And we did have some positive results from that, as some organizations have now committed to supporting Togolese society organization. Then we have the legal aspect as well. We approached the American Bar Association that has helped us observe the trial of many Togolese activists and journalists, and they are continuing to provide this support since 2017. Just recently, a few months ago, they were again involved in the case of a Togolese journalist that was arrested arbitrarily. So the legal support is also something that has been very helpful to us. Now, I will say that in terms of impact, how do we really measure the impact of those different forms of external support? To one extent, I would say there is the authoritarian governments always strive to give the impression that everybody loves them outside of the country, and they sell that image to weaken the people even more by making them feel like nobody will come and save you because we are friends with everyone. So our government spends a lot of money in lobbying activities. 2 years ago, for example, the government of Togo hired a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., paying $1,500 an hour. So we realize that the imagery is important to them. And if we also project ourselves as being the friends of countries that promote democracies, then it's going to counter the narrative that the government's oppressive methods are accepted internationally. So the imagery is important because it also boosts the morals of the people. When people have the feeling that they are being repressed by their government, but that government is supported by other foreign powers, then it makes them feel helpless, and it makes them feel like they cannot overcome the repression of that regime. So the perception is important to boost the morale of the citizens. On another hand as well, we have pushed for certain sanctions against the government of Togo. Some of them haven't been successful, but at least it sent a strong message to the government and the army. For example, we requested that the United Nations stop using Togolese militaries as on peacekeeping missions. And peacekeeping missions are extremely important for the Togolese army because they are better paid when they are sent to those missions. And it's one of the things that the government of Togo prides itself for contributing thousands of soldiers yearly to UN peacekeeping missions. However, there is a clause in the UN stating that governments that are repressive and that are violent cannot participate in peacekeeping missions. So we use that to say that if you continue repressing human rights in Togo, then we are going to do everything possible to ensure that you don't get sent to peacekeeping missions anymore. On the other hand, in the United States, for example, we have also tried to use the Magnitsky Act to file legal cases against the government of Togo, mostly government officials who took part in acts of torture and grave human rights atrocities and abuses, and as well as corruption. We don't have any results yet, but the steps have been taken, and usually legal procedures take years, but at least those are small things that we do that give us a sense of power, that also give our people a sense of accountability, because we feel like we cannot obtain that accountability within our country, but at least we're using external resources to demand that accountability and hopefully obtain it one day. Now, to end my presentation, I will also give an example of one thing we did 2 years ago in 2019. We visited the State Department in the United States and we presented to them the different forms of aid the government of Togo is receiving from the United States government, especially the Togolese army. And we listed the different bilateral agreement between Togo and the US Army. And on the other side, we also presented the different forms of support that the Togolese civil society and democracy groups are receiving from the US government. Turns out that the amount of money invested in supporting the army of the oldest dictatorship in Africa, which is that of Togo, is not even, is actually far bigger than the amount of money spent in supporting civil society. So when we did the calculation, the civil society in Togo was receiving less than 5% of the money that the army was receiving. So our message to the State Department was that you are actually we are not necessarily asking the State Departments to back civil resistance groups or to back civil society groups in Togo, but then we feel like we are fighting, there is no equilibrium. You are empowering them against us because most of the resources you are deploying to the army is being used to attack citizens, to repress citizens, to abuse our rights, and to maintain themselves in power. So if you want to be fair, it's either you reduce funding to the Togolese army or you increase funding to the Togolese society so that we can at least have a fairer way of fighting for change in Togo. So those were messages that we sent to the State Department, and we have seen the government, the US government reduce funding to authoritarian regimes for abusing human rights, like in Cameroon and many other countries, and we hope to see that manifest in Togo as well. But I will stop here, but those are some of the few examples of actions we did to be able to obtain support externally and some of the impact that I can see have happened since so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farida. This is really interesting. I thought in particular how you were talking about the work that you were doing extra institutionally through nonviolent action out on the streets, but then trying to engage in institutional processes and using existing human rights legal frameworks to try to hold people accountable. And I thought I just wanted to highlight another thing that you mentioned that I don't think we've talked about before, is just the importance of international solidarity and ways that civil society organizations and other legal groups can provide aid and support to different groups, especially when it comes to breaking language barriers and helping build capacity and advocacy and things of that nature. So thank you very much. Just for people, I see people have already been adding questions to the chat, but if you're unfamiliar with the Q&A feature on Zoom, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you can start adding questions in for the panel. I see we have a few, so I'll go ahead and take a few in a group and pose it to the panel, and whoever wants to pick it up can, and we'll go ahead and get started. So the first question we have here comes from Syed Ali from Pakistan, and his question is more targeted towards the challenges and perceptions of external support, in particular support that might be coming from the US, and how that might invite repression from the state. So if any of you can comment on that. The next question is, how can movements maintain nonviolent discipline in an era when many movements are becoming purposefully leaderless movements? So in the absence of designated leaders, how do you enforce and maintain discipline? And that comes from Nassim Karouche. And then our final question is from Andrea Filippi, and she asks, how do you know that a civil resistance movement reflects the views of the majority of the population? So I don't know who wants to get us started, but maybe I can pitch it over to you first, Maria.
Sure, thanks, Tabitha. Those are great questions. You know, to the first one, it's a great question, and it's a legitimate concern that foreign government support to domestic movement could result in greater backlash and violent repression being used. I think it's really important to emphasize that there's, you know, I was presenting some findings from the quantitative and qualitative, but there's no template or blueprint for external support. This is good, this is not good. so much depends on consultation with the local actors themselves, who know the history of bilateral relationships. They know the potential repercussions of particular forms of assistance. So I think, you know, those types of interactions need to be central in informing whether foreign governments or any external actor for that matter provides assistance to groups. But it's true. And I would say additionally that often governments are targeting dissidents with violent repression, irregardless if there's foreign or international support for those movements. But foreign support can sometimes be used to justify further repression. And so this, you know, the risks and of this type of reaction absolutely need to be factored into any type of decision making on that. And maybe I'll stop there so Hardy and Frida can address the other questions.
I'll speak to a couple of them. On the question of how do you know if a movement represents the majority of the population, of course, as an outsider, you don't always. And here's how ICNC, the organization that I work at and lead, thinks through this if we're approached. So one thing we'll ask ourselves is the movement fighting for rights? Are rights at stake here? If you have a political system where the institutions generally work, but people just aren't getting what they want from them, then that's politics. That's not something we want to get involved in supporting. If you can make your case freely and openly and you just don't win a majority, trying to take it to civil resistance is not what we want to be involved in. But if your rights are fundamentally being violated, which can happen in democracies too. Democracies don't get a free pass on, oh, if it's a democracy, they'll never violate rights. Not true in my country, hasn't been true in lots of other democracies too. Democracies have their own pockets of authoritarianism within them sometimes. But first, are rights being violated? And if it's a minority group, then a minority rights issue may not have the support of the majority of the population, and that doesn't mean it's not worth supporting, and that doesn't make it, you know, any less worthwhile as a rights issue. A second question is the group committed to nonviolent means? And you know, and we will go on there. We're doing background assessment, looking at various sources to make sure that we understand that group, even if it doesn't have a majority view, at least its views are representative of widely held aspirations and grievances. It's hard to discern this stuff in an authoritarian government because public interest polls may not be taken, and even if they are taken, they may be falsified. There's a documented phenomenon called preference falsification, where if people think a change can't happen or is impossible to happen, or they're scared to publicly call for it to happen, they may not say, yes, we want it to happen, even though deep down they want it to happen. So it can be challenging to assess this. On the question of nonviolent discipline with leaderless movements, one thing that the internet has shown is that you can get rapid mobilization. We've seen rapid mobilization many times, but not necessarily mobilization that has a direction after it's happened. And so in general, movements that I've seen that have been more effective are ones that do a fair amount of work internally about what their principles are, what their goals are, what their strategy is ahead of time, build from there with a heavy emphasis on training people in nonviolent discipline, training people in nonviolent tactics, building that social cohesion tightly. And once they have a model that works, if they call for mobilization and they do it and people show up at it, people are showing up to that movement's actions, and that movement is committed to nonviolent discipline. So it's no longer everyone shows up and then everyone has to decide what we all agree to and don't agree to. It's, we're calling for this, we're organized, these are our principles, this is how we do things, these are our goals. If you come join, you're agreeing to that. So that's one way to do it. And again, the emphasis here on training, on making sure that, you know, we recognize that activists and organizers have an incredibly hard job, an incredibly important job, and they are so undersupported at every level. They're undersupported financially in terms of the ability to make an income, but they're also undersupported in terms of the ability to get access to resources, education, and mentorship that people in other professions would. So training can be very effective internationally, though internationally you want to make sure that you are not giving advice, you're just sharing knowledge. Locally, it's even more effective. Activists are very good trainers for others across borders. There's lots of ways in which it can be done, but a heavy emphasis on training is important. Thanks.
Frida, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think Maria and Hadi have covered it all, so we can move to the next question and I'll take those ones.
Okay, sounds
So
great.
maybe I'll just take oh no, we haven't gotten to the one on sabotage, or was that part of
No, that's
I can't remember.
no, that's the next round. And actually, we may only have time to do one more round, so I'm going to try to bucket at least 4 questions into this one. So one is the question that Maria was just mentioning on how do you define nonviolent? There's a great question from Selma in here about what that includes, if sabotage, occupation, vandalism are included in that definition. And then it looks like we have 2 questions about the right to assist doctrine. Hardy, you're in Peter's report. So one is from Paolo Bargiacci, who says, would the R2A doctrine be in line with Article 2.7 of the UN Charter prohibiting intervention in internal affairs? And then Rob Kushin also asks, he wonders about articulating a right to assist for NGO actors with regard to other forms of civic engagement in the wake of serious restrictions that can be placed on bilateral actors like governments. And then Aliyah Braley gives you some support and then also asks about the main sticking points in providing assistance to civil resistance movements. And if that's, the lack of information supporting the research that Maria and Erica have just completed, or is it more that there is an international legal barrier or lack of legitimizing that kind of support? And then she also asks, is there potentially a large sphere of supporting heating up conflicts among NGOs and governments who do not want to be associated with the potential for outbreaks of violence? So it's more of a question of what is most important, research, marketing, building legal frameworks, or destigmatizing support for nonviolent conflict somehow. So yeah, maybe we can start with those. And if we have more time, I'll come back to the other questions. And maybe we can start with Farida this time.
Thank you, Tabata. To answer the first question about sabotage, occupation, vandalism, these also fall under nonviolence. I will say that the principle of nonviolence is actually any action that doesn't cause harm to the other party. And when it comes to vandalism, in certain cases, it can cause harm and can be targeted as a violent action instead of a non-violent one. Examples of non-violent actions that I will give are things such as strikes, protests, sit-ins, marches, group gatherings, even some religious events, writing petitions, anything that doesn't involve physical violence and lethal force, or anything that can cause harm to the other party, or even to harm to the members of your group, will fall under the non-violence category. So that would be my question. That would be my answer to that based on my best knowledge, but I think Maria will be able to provide more elaborated answers. Now, to the following question. The following question actually goes more to Hardy, but there is another question addressed directly to me, asking if about the donors that I have interacted with. So if the support actually comes from any kinds of donors, and if there are different type of support. So I will say that my organization, the Togolese Civil League itself, in the first years of the movement, we didn't seek direct external support. Most of the money we were raising were internally. It wasn't until about 2 years later that we started reaching out to international donors, but it was about obtaining resources to be able to fund educational materials and capacity building on civil resistance. But one of the things that we wanted to do capacity on as well, and we did, was on digital security, because the government invested massively on acquiring digital surveillance materials, and many of our activists got arrested because their phones were surveilled by the government, and the conversation they had in their privacy were used against them, and they were sentenced to very heavy sentences in prison. So we realized that the having digital security training was very important, and we seek external support to be able to conduct those trainings and raise the resources for this. It was more expensive especially because we had to fly the activists and the journalists outside of Togo for security purposes, because the government was basically tracing everybody and they could use that opportunity to arrest everyone during a meeting like this one. So those were the cases in which we use foreign resources for, and also for capacity building in terms of nonviolent organizing and strategizing as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. So we'll let Hardy address the R2A one. Frida, I think that was a fine definition about sabotage and the like, that we could spend actually 2.5 hours talking about whether property damage and sabotage is violent, nonviolent. For purposes like academic definitions in the book, we used violence as that which inflicts bodily harm on another human being or threatens to do so. So that's definitionally how we directed it. But I would say sometimes there's a distinction between, you know, what maybe technically nonviolent and the like, and what is strategically effective. And Farida was pointing out that sometimes, you know, engaging in certain tactics and the like, while they can be understandable, can bring greater crackdowns, can, you know, decrease participation for people who don't want to be part of them, decrease support for the cause. Anyway, so there are ramifications beyond pure definitions and the like that are at play here. I would just very briefly to Rob Cushion's point, I think it's a really good one. And we're living, he was asking about what about articulating a right to assist for NGO actors with regard to other forms of civic engagement. And I really think that type of right could be included and is included in the right to assist. So I think it's part, you know, the NGO assistance to nonviolent actors who are involved in a movement, and many of those are NGOs themselves, you know, should be part of the conversation as well. Movements are comprised of many different individuals, organizations, and the like. So a movement comprises a lot of different actors. And I think particularly in this era of closing civic space, and the fact that what we're talking about is the fundamental violation of rights to assembly, speech, and the like by these regimes, a coordinated, coherent theory of supporting NGOs and other groups that are involved in realizing basic human rights. And that's really what we're talking about here, is the realization of basic human rights should definitely, you know, be part of the conversation. And then Aliyah had a number of different points. I would say all of the above in terms of what needs more research, marketing, building legal frameworks, destigmatizing. I think this is very much a nascent area of study. And I should have said in my remarks, huge thank you to ICNC for funding and supporting the research that went into the soon to be published monograph. It was a huge effort, and we're incredibly grateful for that kind of support. So all of the above. And I'll let Hardy, because I know we're getting at time, maybe address the ones that are specifically related to R2A.
Great, thank you. With regards to R2A and the permissibility of certain forms of support and concerns about interventionism, you know, authoritarians have increasingly pushed a discourse of what we could refer to as hyper-sovereignty, the idea that as an authoritarian or as the head of state, self-declared or otherwise, I have the right to stop anything at my borders, anything, and to declare whatever I want to be intervention. Interestingly, they don't think that way about external business support or external military support or any other form of support, but when it comes to civil society, man, they love to draw the line and say, this is interventionism. And the idea that sovereignty just stops the debate, it's a debate stopper, what can you say, really needs to be questioned for a few reasons. The first is that a great many acts of civil resistance are covered under international human rights laws and may well be covered under domestic human rights laws and constitutions, right? So another one is that certain rights are reciprocal. If I have a right of freedom of association to associate with you, I have a right to be associated with. If I have a right to freely express myself, I also have a right to freely be expressed to give information as well as to receive information. And I'm not an international lawyer, but you can find scholars such as Elizabeth Wilson, who spoke at last week's event. You can find people like the former UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Assembly and Association, Mina Kiai, who's written extensively about this, who says, you know, sovereignty is not considered a vital interest of the state where they can just say, to protect sovereignty, we curtail the following rights. There's nowhere that doesn't exist. It's something that they assert. A third point is that certain forms of support to civil resistance are primarily about information sharing. It's about training, a significant amount. Movements generally, in my view, are not going to succeed or fail based on how much money they get. Financing has a place, or money can have a place. But as Maria said earlier, that was not the top finding of what really makes or breaks a movement. Skills matter. Strategy matters. The choices that activists make are incredibly important. Information that's going to help them make their choices the best way they can, again, through whether it's mentorship from others, activists engaging in best practices, the exposure to certain resources, you name it. Saying that the authoritarian or any state has a right to embargo information that's based on social science and the exercise of human rights is quite a stretch. And yet, in some cases, the most effective form of support might be actually the least interventionist, which further strains the idea that sovereignty can stop it. A fourth point is that sovereignty, the idea that sovereignty resides inherently in the head of state is also a fallacy. Sovereignty resides in the population. They can vest it in the head of state through processes that imbue the head of state with the ability to claim sovereignty. If the head of state says, you know what, I got sovereignty once through an election, I'll never have another free election again, and I'll keep asserting sovereignty, the people have given it to me, that's not a credible claim, especially if they have to maintain that head of state role by using repression against people. So as repression escalates, the assertion of sovereignty becomes more porous. And the international community has already acknowledged this. And the responsibility to protect the idea that at the extreme, external military intervention could be warranted and acceptable if a head of state is going to commit atrocities against its own people, already shows that the idea of sovereignty as a conversation stopper is not there, that as a head of state becomes more abusive, their claim to sovereignty becomes more tenuous. So there's lots of ways we can tackle that. I'm not an international lawyer, but I can refer you to, and you can find references in the Right to Assist report about it. And I'll make one last point on the question of why aren't more international actors engaging in this? I think there's an openness now to external support and thinking through this that I haven't seen as much over the last decade. Now is a really great moment to be making the case internally to your organizations. We have a great body of research to show that movements matter, to show they're effective, to show that they're a great investment of resources. And I think we need a lot more internal champions doing that, championing within their organizations. And we need the academic community, which has really picked up, to continue to provide research that allows people to make that case. So I think the time is ripe, and I hope more organizations do it. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much to all of the panelists. And with one request for panelists, if you can, we had a question about, any sort of resources and literature that you would recommend on legal aid to civic resistance movements. So if you could just drop that in the chat. And then the last question I want to ask is for Farida. As someone who is doing this work on the front lines and has a Pan-African network of activists that you work with and support and show solidarity to, what is the main thing that you want this community here to take away in terms of how they can most effectively support movements?
Thank you, Tabata. And I will speak from a perspective that the majority of the people on this panel today are living in the West, non-African countries. There are a few things that I will recommend. The first one will be putting, I wouldn't say pressure, but at least trying to bring the issue of human rights violations and torture and abuses in a specific country that you're supporting the campaign in, hopefully Togo, to legislators in your country, and ask for a commission of inquiry into those atrocities. Simple messages can sometimes lead to the response of those legislators. I'm sorry, my toddler is participating to the discussion in the background. And we, these messages from legislators also does play a role on the ground. The other thing that I will also say is to kind of like reach out directly to the movement's leaders and ask them what type of support that they need. Because sometimes we try to anticipate or generalize thinking that everybody needs the same type of support, but the priorities are different from one country to another, and you may be able to provide better help if you ask them what they are in need of and what the priorities are for their movement. The support can be material, it can be financial, it can be a resource. In the US, for example, we had one young man who reached out to us, and he's a young lawyer who asked how he can help, and he's the one who helped us with the Magnitsky case that we are working on. So there are different ways that you can support, but the best thing to do is to ask, and people will be able to tell you and direct you in the right direction.
Great, thanks very much, Farida. And with that, we're at time. I just want to thank again ICNC and ASIL for providing the space for this conversation.